Welcome to CEDA's live stream on the Aged Care Royal Commission, The Way Forward. This event is part of our series of events and research on human services. CEDA will be continuing this discussion over coming months as we progress research into the aged care sector and building the caring workforce Australia needs. My name is Cassandra Windsor and I'm Senior Economist at CEDA, the Committee for Economic Development of Australia. CEDA acknowledges that today and every day we're on Aboriginal land. Committed to recognition and reconciliation, we respect elders and we support their stated aspirations. Today I'm coming to you from Perth, on land of the Wadjuk people of the Noongar Nation, and I'd like to pay my respects to the elders past, present and emerging. The work that CEDA does is only possible through the incredible support of our members. To that end, I'd like to acknowledge the sponsors of today's live stream, Westpac and Nous, and thank them for their ongoing support. I'll now hand you over to Stephen Teulan, Principal at Nous, to introduce our speaker and facilitate today's discussion. Thank you, Stephen.
Thanks, Cass. Good morning, I'm Steve Teulan, the Principal at Nous Group. Welcome to CEDA's Aged Care Royal Commission, The Way Forward, where the Federal Minister for Senior Australians and Aged Care Services, Senator the Honourable Richard Colbeck, will give a timely response to the Royal Commission's final report into aged care quality and safety and the government's plans to reform and support Australia's aged care system. CEDA's 2021 program will continue to offer a diverse array of discussion forums, both face-to-face and virtual, to allow people from all over Australia to participate in and to inform and promote debate of critical issues. To keep abreast of the range of events and discussions on the most important issues impacting Australia's economic and social development, we encourage you to visit CEDA's website, ceda.com.au, where you can also register for upcoming events and watch the recordings of past live streams. CEDA also produces regular podcasts, video interviews and blogs with leading experts and policymakers to ensure you can remain up to date with quality information on key issues impacting the economy more broadly. These are also available through CEDA's website. Today, as at all CEDA events, you'll be able to interact with our speaker through our Q&A portal, which is available via the link below the video on your screen. Or you can enter in the details by going to ceda.pigeonhole.at and using the passcode AGEDCARE. Post your own questions and vote on the questions which have been raised by other people. You can also join the conversation on Twitter by using today's hashtag, which is #AgedCareRC, and tagging CEDA at CEDA_news. Now, I'd like to welcome you all to this important forum. And before introducing the Senator, just note that aged care policy in Australia for the last decade has been focused on three goals: informing, protecting and empowering older Australians, providing the opportunity for older people to continue to live and receive care and support in their own homes, and to achieve sustainability of the aged care system in relation to workforce sustainability and financial sustainability. While steps have been taken towards those goals, and notwithstanding the daily efforts of so many committed staff in aged care services, too often the system has let down older people. It's tolerated neglect and abuse and imposed an unacceptable personal cost on older Australians, their families and carers. Older Australians and their advocates made it clear that the system is broken and too often does not work for them, their families and carers. It was that dissatisfaction which created the impetus for the Royal Commission into Aged Care Quality and Safety. The Royal Commission vindicated their views. Its recommendations offer genuine hope that older Australians can enjoy greater influence, choice and control, and that they can experience the care and support they deserve. The Morrison government established the Royal Commission, and its response will play a significant part in determining whether those hopes are realised. I'd like to welcome Senator the Honourable Richard Colbeck, Federal Minister for Senior Australians and Aged Care Services, Minister for Sport, for a keynote address on the government's response to the Commission's final report and to inform us of plans to improve quality and safety in aged care and aged care services in Australia. Welcome, Senator. Welcome to this forum. We look forward to hearing from you. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen, and can I, at the outset, acknowledge the Indigenous owners of the lands on which we all meet, the very many of them across this country, and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. And can I thank you for the opportunity to speak today. The impact of COVID over the last 6 or 8 months has meant that this is our third attempt to have this conversation, but I think at the end of the day, it comes at quite an opportune time with us having in the last 2 weeks received the recommendations of the Royal Commission into Aged Care Quality and Safety, a process which was one of the first acts of Prime Minister Morrison after he became Prime Minister, when he couldn't be assured that the questions that he was asking were getting the answers that he was looking for. He said at the time that we were going to hear some very difficult things, and we've done that. We have heard some very difficult things, and it's put aged care in the national spotlight in a way that I don't think it ever has been before. And as I said to the Australian community when the Royal Commission's interim report was brought down, it put us all on notice, not just the Australian government, not just the Australian aged care sector, but also the Australian community. It put us all on notice that we all needed to look closely at the way that the aged care system was operating. We cannot shy away from the challenges that exist in reforming the system, but it's important that we do. And so the fact that this sector now has the public profile that it does is a good thing in the context of a driver for reform. And of course, now having received the report, as we did on Monday of last week, we now have the challenge of redesigning the way that the system works and ensuring that senior Australians get the care that they're assessed as needing and deserve when they need it. Obviously, parts of the Royal Commission's report are extremely difficult to read in all its incarnations, whether that was the interim report delivered in 2019, the COVID report that was delivered last year, or the Royal Commission's final report that we received last week. But what we need to remember is that these are our family members. These are our parents, grandparents, friends, and they didn't deserve the lack of care and poor treatment that they experienced. And so what we now owe them and all of those, particularly those who provided submissions to the Royal Commission, and I thank them for doing that, to reform and restructure the system to provide a level of care in the way we feel that they deserve. And it's, as the Prime Minister said, this is a once-in-a-generation opportunity. The sector has the spotlight on it, and we have a report which gives us a very strong roadmap to restore confidence in the sector, respect of the sector, and to reform the sector. While making that point, I think it's also important to acknowledge that we have continued to undertake a number of reforms over the period of the Royal Commission being undertaken that were important and were already underway. Things like new quality standards, Charter of Rights for senior Australians in aged care, and a number of other regulatory changes that provided the Aged Care Quality and Safety Commission, for example, additional powers and resources to oversight the sector. And during the period of COVID, we've invested in excess of $1.8 billion to assist the sector to deal with the very, very difficult circumstances of the pandemic. The report itself is clearly an important milestone. It gives us detail on how far we've come, but also what we now need to do to deliver an appropriate system. It is going to take some time. This will be a journey for not just the government, but for the sector itself. We need to be mindful of building the capacity of the sector in that process, but also the entire community. Only by clearly understanding the needs of Australians, senior Australians, as well as the expectations of the government, the aged care sector and the community, can we ensure that we deliver a system that delivers better outcomes. And the Prime Minister said at the outset, if you want to deal with a problem, you have to be fair dinkum about understanding the full extent of it. We wanted the Royal Commission to provide us with a forensic overview of the sector. That's what they've done. And the scale and the scope of the report and the expectations of the community demand a comprehensive understanding of its outcomes and its recommendations, and that's what the government will deliver. We intend to provide to the Australian community, as the Royal Commission requested, a full response to the report by 31st of May. The substantive response to the report will come in the budget with a significant number of elements there. And of course, we made, when we released the report last week, a number of initial responses that we saw as being important as a part of our initial response to the report. It's clear that we need to go back to the very foundations of the aged care system, and the central tenet of that has to be a commitment of respect for senior Australians and providing them with the services that they need to access as they're assessed to need them. So the report talks about respect for Australians across the system, and I think that that's one of the things that we need to keep in mind as a part of our design, and needs to be a function of the way that the system operates. Without respect for senior Australians, it's unlikely that we'll see the necessary improvements to quality or safety in aged care. And one of the things that I still recall and struck me from the interim report was the fact that almost 50% of people in residential aged care receive no visitors. So this is not just a government problem. This is not just a aged care sector problem. This is a broader community issue that we need to deal with. So in the context of reforming the sector into the future, we'll be framing our response through 5 pillars. Home care, residential aged care quality and safety, improving residential care services and sustainability. And the sustainability of the sector is one that's been discussed quite a bit. Workforce is a significant factor in the reform of the system. And of course, there is governance. And that comes to us from both an overall government-focused governance system, and of course then it devolves right down to the governance of providers at a very localised level. This will, these themes will ensure that our work addresses all of the necessary reforms in the areas of greatest need, and of course that bring most benefit to most people. Among the important actions going forward will be the commencement of work and the consultation to replace the Aged Care Act of 1997, and that will ensure that our reforms are built on strong foundations with senior Australians at the centre of our processes. As I indicated, we've taken immediate action in our response to the report with just over $450 million in new measures to address some of the pressing concerns. Some of those immediate actions include $280 million through a couple of measures to residential aged care providers to ensure stability and quality of care, particularly as we prepare our comprehensive response to the Commission, and that goes to sustainability, and part of that is $189.8 million to assist providers to maintain their services while we prepare a comprehensive response. And that equates to about $760 per resident in metropolitan residential aged care and $1,145 for those in rural, regional and remote areas. and a continuation of the 30% increase in the homeless and viability supplements until the end of June. And that's a continuation of some of the assistance that we've had in place through the particularly difficult periods of the COVID outbreak. We're also looking to provide an additional targeted funding of $90 million to support providers who are facing financial stress, particular financial stress, and that continues on from some measures that we've had in place for a period of time now, and we have been working with some providers to assist them to improve elements of their business to ensure they're more viable and provide them with a long-term future, which is something that we see as extremely important. And part of that will be particularly important in rural and regional areas where aged care providers not only provide an important service, but they are a very important part of local communities. We've provided an additional $62 million for some measures to strengthen aged care providers' capabilities in meeting quality and safety recommendations. And of course, we're working with the Quality and Safety Commission to support an additional 1,500 site audits in 21-22 so that we can be comfortable ourselves that we have appropriate oversight of the sector and that quality services are being provided around the country, and that's a really important part of what we do. Workforce is also an important element of this, and so $92 million over 4 years to support an additional recruitment drive. This is an initial recruitment drive to attract about 18,000 care workers into the sector. The recommendations of the report fully implemented will require much more than that. So this is an initial contribution to that. And one of the other elements is to ensure some pricing transparency for home care, given that that is one of the areas of concern that I see on a very regular basis. So increasing the pricing transparency of home care services, which are obviously ramping up significantly, and we've invested an enormous amount over the last few years to reduce waiting lists. And so ensuring that people have good understanding of the costs involved and what the fees that they might be facing is going to be extremely important as part of that process. The funding to the sector is also important, and looking back to see where we've come from already, I think, is an important part of this discussion. When we came to government in 2013, the funding to the sector was somewhere in the order of $13.3 billion a year. This financial year, it'll be $23.8 billion a year. It's grown significantly by about $1.2 billion a year over the last decade, and over the forward estimates, over that 4-year period, the additional investment as of the last budget is something in the order of $8 billion. So the investment has continued to grow, particularly through our investment since the 18-19 budget into home care, where we've invested more than $5.5 billion into more than 83,000 additional home care packages. And of course, provision of home care packages was one of the key elements that was discussed in the Royal Commission's report, both the interim report and the final report, and growing that sector so that people are able to age at home as they want is clearly something the Australian community is looking for. The Aged Care Quality and Safety Commission didn't exist in its current form when we came to government. In fact, it has only existed since January of 2019, and the process to create that organisation in the current structure was finalised in some legislation that was passed in late 2019 and came into force at the beginning of 2020. So if you think about the fact that the Commission came into effect in January of 2019, it was put into its final structure in January of 2020. And the work that has had to occur over the period of 2020 during the pandemic, it gives a fair indication of the task that was set for the Commission themselves a very, very difficult one. The term building the plane while flying it has been used on a number of occasions over the last 12 months, but has given an indication of the task that's been faced by the Aged Care Quality and Safety Commission in not only providing oversight of the sector, but providing oversight of the sector during the COVID-19 pandemic has been a significant one. The Royal Commission's interim report talked for action with respect to home care packages, and I've just mentioned the overall amount of support that's gone into that, an initial $496 million for 10,000 packages in response to the Royal Commission's interim report, and since then we've put in an additional 39,105 packages in response to that interim, in response to the report to build the capacity of the home care system. We've put $25.5 million to improve medication management, particularly to reduce the use of chemical restraints, and we will have new regulations for chemical restraint by the 1st of July this year off the back of a review that was conducted in the second half of last year. We've put additional $10 million to increase support for dementia behaviour management through advisory services and training for care workers. And can I say, in the context of development of the workforce, ensuring that skills in relation to dementia behaviour and management is going to be extremely important, given that about 50% of people in residential aged care have a diagnosis of dementia. So that needs to become part of doing business every day. And importantly, one of the things that came through in the interim report was those under 65 who are in residential aged care, and we've put $4.7 million to take more of them out of residential aged care, and we continue to work with my colleague Stuart Robert, who has responsibility for the NDIS, to ensure that there is capacity available to change that paradigm completely with respect to younger people in residential aged care. In response to the COVID report, again, we made some specific responses in relation to the issues that came through in the COVID report, particularly close to $58 million to state jurisdictions to assist them to support infection prevention control, training in residential aged care facilities. We brought forward the Serious Incident Response Scheme, and of course we provided some support to the sector themselves for infection control leads within the facilities, and again, going back to the workforce, $10.8 million to enhance the skills and leadership qualities in aged care nurses. And the continuation of that is going to be an important part of our broader response, because certainly what we've seen through the Royal Commission, but also through COVID, is that the leadership skills in a clinical sense, particularly through the clinical leads within facilities, has a significant influence on the quality of care that's being provided. And we also put $63.3 million into support aged care residents to access mental health support and services off the back of COVID. And we know that the isolation that we all saw ourselves through COVID was magnified, particularly in residential aged care, because many people were restricted to their rooms as a part of trying to protect them from COVID, but also isolated from their families. So support in the context of mental health was extremely important as we came through the COVID period. Obviously, now that we've received the report, we're giving all of the recommendations within it very careful consideration. But the essential fundamentals for aged care need to be trust, dignity and respect. And so while we're considering those recommendations, I'll share with you some of the vision that we have for the aged care sector in the country. As I mentioned earlier, a foundation of respect for senior Australians must permeate all aspects of aged care, but we can't stop there in the context of our reforms. The quality of services must be one of the main focuses, and we also need to support senior Australians, of the right of senior Australians to access safe, high quality and compassionate care services. I talked before about price transparency, high levels of quality and mandatory safety standards. We want to see an aged care system which empowers senior Australians and their families with greater choice over their care and the services as they age. And this means options which are clear and easy to understand and simple to navigate. And so providing a continuum of care from the simplest of services through what we now know as CHSP right through to residential aged care, with systems and processes that are as consistent as possible as people graduate through those levels of service is important. And ensuring that people have choice between providers who all offer high quality service is going to be something that will be important to the way that the system operates as well. I've said a couple of times that the culture of the sector must be dignity and respect, and the systems that we put in place need to drive that. I think off the back of the Royal Commission process, Australians will quite rightly demand that services are conducted with compassion, dignity and respect, and that's the least that we should be expecting from our service provision. We envisage that senior Australians accessing care provided in the broader community with support of the entire health sector and by carers, and this is quite important, I think. We need to support carers, both professional and family. Informal and family care is not separate to our aged care system, so it's important that the systems that support families in provision of that care are there as well. So respite services which help families to provide that care at home and support families in provision of care are appropriately funded and appropriately responsive. There's clearly some work that we need to do in that sense. Aged care is a critical part of the Australian society. So it forms a compact which we're all party to, and as we get older, we want to be able to get the services that we demand and expect. So those things are important, and as taxpayers, we want to make sure that the services that we're funding through the resources that we're putting in through our taxes are providing a high quality of care and supporting senior Australians in the way that we expect that they should. So the Royal Commission's put all this in pretty stark focus for us. Now the task is for us to consider the 148 recommendations from the Royal Commission. We acknowledge that there are some differences between the commissioners that we'll have to make some choices on. We will do that. But the thing that I would like to see, and my commitment as a minister in the government as a part of this, is to redesign a system that provides for that level of quality and respect for senior Australians, so that Australians who are funding the system through their taxes or through their own contributions can be confident that the care that they receive will be as they are assessed as needing, but with all the appropriate levels of respect and quality that senior Australians deserve. So thanks for the opportunity to present today. It is a significant and a time in history for us, I think, in the context of provision of care. And as I indicated earlier, the Royal Commission's report provides us a once-in-a-generational opportunity to significantly reform the way that aged care in this country is delivered to community expectations. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Minister. I think thank you for outlining where things are up to in terms of the government's response. And I think we can all agree with your aspiration to redesign a system based on quality and respect. Now we'll move into the questions, and just if I can continue to encourage people to to put their questions up so that the Minister can be asked about those. Minister, you talked about it being a major reform, which of course it is. It's a huge reform. And you said it's going to take some time. But the question is, when can older people expect to see some real changes? And what can they expect to see first? When are they actually going to see something happen as a result of this?
Well, of course, as I indicated during my address, we have continued to reform the system as the Royal Commission has been progressing, because there have been a number of things that we regarded as being important as part of that process. So, and that's why we've made a number of steps immediately to support some changes to the way that the system operates, to support providers in the provision of quality care immediately. So, for example, the funding that we put in to support providers with governance within their own businesses, those sorts of things, that support can be a part of a process of improvement immediately. And one thing that I think I mentioned, but if I didn't, I should have done, was how we ensure that the systems that we put in place promote continuous improvement of the aged care sector and a culture of continuous improvement as well. So we will continue to see improvements immediately. Obviously, when the dominant response to the Royal Commission will come in the budget, and that will address things like access to home care services, the work that we're doing around pricing and transparency of home care services. We'd like to see effects of that happen very quickly, because this sector is growing quite rapidly. We're currently putting out, at the moment, offering Australians about 1,200 new home care packages a week. So that's a significant investment that we continue to make. So those sorts of reforms in respect of capacity will continue to occur. But there are some things that take time. The Royal Commission put a time frame for the major element of the reforms of over 5 years. But we will continue to work to improve the way that the sector operates as that time frame progresses. So, for example, it's probably a couple of years that'll be required for a new Act, and that will provide the foundations. So the scoping, the drafting, and the legislating of a new Act is going to take a period of time, and that, of course, provides the foundations. Some of the governance issues, and this is where the questions relate to the differences between the Royal Commissioners in the context of the governance on the behalf of government come into place, because setting up a completely new structure will take time, and that will obviously impact on the speed of the capacity for government or the system to react. So we have to have those things in mind as a part of our decision-making process. But we would expect that people will continue to see improvements and change as we progress. As I said in my address, we'll have new regulations with respect to the use of restraints, chemical and physical, by the beginning of the new financial year, because the existing regulations have a sunset clause as of 30 June, so we will have to have new regulations based on the review that we conducted in the second half of last year by the 1st of July this year. So all of those reforms, improvements will continue to be undertaken as we work our way through the response to the Royal Commission and implementing the recommendations from that.
Thanks, Minister. There's a question that we have about the extension of the temporary MBS items available for residents and residential aged care in allied health primary care. Are you able to say whether you expect those to continue beyond their current sort of end date?
Well, their end date, I think, goes out towards the end of this calendar year at this stage, but the integration of the primary health system and the hospital-based system with the aged care system is one of the big questions and issues that has been discussed through the Royal Commission. And in fact, those MBS items that we've put in place were as a result of recommendations from the COVID special report. So how we create a system of care in this country that is less siloed, if you like, how we integrate the aged care system with the primary and clinical care systems is a very important question. And in that context, that goes back to some of the assessment processes that we are also in the process of reforming right now. So the question of the system of assessment, ensuring that system asks all the right questions in the right way about a particular person's needs, and how that information on that assessment is carried with them through the system so that it's available to aged care providers and other health care providers as a part of their provision of care. So integration of those systems, I think, is going to be one of the really important parts of reform. The Royal Commission process has actually asked some questions of the system that perhaps hadn't necessarily been visible to everybody, and highlighted those and brought about some of the reforms that we're currently seeing. And so those, again, will be important decisions in relation to the reform process going ahead. In some circumstances, we've been providing funding to the aged care sector to provide some of those services. And so that's created some of the questions that might arise around where we appropriately resource the funding of those particular items of care.
Thanks, Minister. One of the questions is about the fact that there's a lot of emphasis on safety, if you like, as part of aged care, as it should be. But as you mentioned before, a large number of residents in residential aged care don't have anyone visiting them. And so the actual environment, the social environment, the environment in which people live and participate and contribute to their community, both the one that they're in, the social program and that type of thing, where does that figure in the thinking of government about the future of aged care? To what extent can we ensure that people are actually not just sitting there left with nothing to do, but actually engaged, and that there are social and other programs that enable people to have decent lives, not just receive safe care?
Look, I think this is going to be one of the really important questions, and how we measure that and report that back to the community as a quality indicator, if you like, in the context of provision of care is going to be quite important. The Royal Commission talks about the transparency of the sector, the reporting back of a number of quality indicators. They did quite a bit of work in respect of quality indicators and reporting of that back to the community, so people had an understanding of care, not just necessarily from a clinical perspective or a safety perspective, but measuring all of these things. And then again, how it's resourced is going to be a very important question. It's not necessarily something that the Royal Commission gave us particular guidance on or specific guidance on, but it remains a question that needs to be asked. And I have to say, it's one of the things that struck me as I engaged with the sector and people who are within it, but also when you look at some of the other programs or processes that have looked into the aged care sector, the actual capacity of people that exist that are living within aged care and their capacity to continue to make a contribution in a real sense, I think is something that we also need to look at and recognise and ask ourselves the question as to how we actually facilitate that. The ABC program, Aged Care for 4-year-olds, I think was one that I started watching out of a sense of duty, but then was watching it because of what it actually told me and what it brought me in the context of, the people themselves, but also what they still had to contribute. And I think we need to remember those things as part of our design of the system and how we report that publicly and what we expect as a broader community that the sector might provide.
Thanks, Minister. There's a question about the use of a pricing authority and the ability of that pricing authority to give hope to aged care providers that they are going to be paid a fair amount in future. Can you just share the government or your views in relation to the role of that pricing authority and the commitment to actually establish something which can be the basis for a fair assessment of what aged care providers should be paid?
Look, I think that's a reasonable question, and I did reflect in my comments earlier about the resourcing of the sector to be able to provide an appropriate level of care. And that is a very, very important question. Alongside that sits the appropriate reporting of how those funds are utilised in the provision of care and reported back to government. And clearly, I don't believe that we have appropriate reporting levels at this point in time. And the Commission makes some quite specific responses in respect of the process of assessing the cost of provision of care, and then that how that's appropriated to the sector. And I think it's inevitable that we will go down that path. There are a couple of different models that are in the Royal Commission's report as to what that might look like and how we appropriate the resources to be provided. But I think that we've all recognised that the current funding instrument in ACFI is no longer fit for purpose. It doesn't provide, or it provides poor incentive in respect of provision of care, quite frankly. And so and the sector would understand that we've been looking at a new funding instrument for a period of time now, or we're relatively well advanced in the decision-making process around that. And so one of the elements of that is how the cost of provision of care is assessed. And we now have to make a decision between the recommendations of the two commissioners of which version or mix of versions that we undertake. But the resourcing of the sector in provision of care is clearly one of the significant questions that we need to answer, along with how the sector report back and provide visibility around expenditure of funds. And that will be one of the features that you'll see in our response that comes through in the budget.
Thanks, Minister. There's also a question along the lines of funding, which is about the role of refundable accommodation deposits in future. And certainly the commissions, particularly Commissioner Briggs, makes some significant comments about the future of refundable accommodation deposits as a basis for accommodation funding. Do you have any views on what has been a really significant pillar of the funding of aged care in Australia?
Yeah, look, RADs or deposits or whatever you would like to call them have been a very important part of the capitalisation of the infrastructure for aged care in this country. But we have seen over recent years a trend for consumers of aged care to move towards the DAPs, the daily accommodation payments. And so that has placed some stress on the sector. But the provision of that capital resource to provide and to actually, I'll say reform, but to change the physical infrastructure of aged care in this country based on consumer demand has been very, very important. At the end of the day, though, it comes back a bit to the previous question, that the resourcing to the sector, however it's funded, needs to be adequate to properly resource the various elements of the provision of care, whether that be accommodation or social support or the provision of clinical care. So the Royal Commission has opinions on each of those different elements. There are some natural fault lines there. I'm of the view that if somebody has the capacity to make a contribution to the roof over their head, which they do through the rest of their working life, it's reasonable to expect that they continue to do that when they're in a residential aged care setting. I don't think it's an unreasonable thing for the broader community to expect that people make that contribution. But how they're structured is one of the significant questions that we're going to have to grapple with out of the Royal Commission process. The the issue of RADs is one that has become more difficult through COVID, as we've seen people shy away from residential aged care. It has actually put some stress on a number of providers with respect to their capital capacity. And so that is going to be one of the very important questions. We've been working on some options around that for a period of time now, in pretty intense conversations with some providers within the sector to do that. But that is going to be a very important part of our reform process, because the capitalisation of the sector is important, and the way, and if we were to pivot around that, we need to be very careful about the impact on those providers who are heavily invested in refundable accommodation deposits. But we also need to provide some flexibility in the way that the system works, and some scope for innovation in the way that providers are providing not only care but the infrastructure that supports it. So we don't want it to be a system that's overly regulated and stifles that innovation. If you look at the physical and the built environment of residential aged care in this country over the last 2 or 3 decades, it has changed significantly, largely, well, dominantly without government regulation, based on consumer demand, and changed for the better. And we need to have the flexibility within the system for it to continue to do that.
Thanks, Minister. Minister, you spoke about innovation. There's several questions here about the innovation, technology, research, and whether, for example, technology can be used to support, if you like, a more capable workforce, or a better supported workforce. One of the questions from Dr. George Margalis is how will the government actually support that? We've got a lot of services out there that are, just doing their job each day. How will the government actually provide the support that's needed to actually promote innovation, the use of technology, and greater focus on research?
Well, there's a number of things rolled in there together, and I'm not surprised George has asked that question. It's he has a particular interest in that, and he knows my views only too well, which I'm happy to share here. The use of technology, in my view, has an enormous capacity to assist the sector to innovate in the provision of care across all different formats of care, whether that be care in the home or residential aged care. In the residential aged care system, it has, I think, a number of opportunities, both in the reporting of the quality of care, the reporting that I've talked about a number of times in the context of the utilisation of the financial resources that government and users of the system put in as a part of their contribution to care. And I'm of the view that we need to require the sector to utilise care for those reporting requirements. For example, at the moment, about 40% of aged care providers still report their quality indicators on a manual basis. I'm of the view, and I've discussed this with the sector on a number of occasions, that we ought to require within a period of time, an appropriate period of time, that all providers are reporting their quality indicators automatically, effectively, into a government-to-business receivable system that can take that information, but also enable it to be interrogated. The Royal Commission talked on a number of occasions through its process about the availability of data on the sector. The Commission talks about the development of quality indicators, how they're reported. I think they should be effectively reported automatically to the system, going into a star rating system or something of that nature, so that people understand how the systems, how individual operators are operating compared to others. Financial reporting similarly. And I know that that's going to require, in some places, some support from government, and also some additional research. But I think it's a path we need to go down, and we must go down. I don't think the current systems that we're utilising are optional anymore, because I think we have the capacity to do it, and it will, I think, importantly, increase the capacity of the Quality and Safety Commission in whatever its final form is after these processes continue to assess providers and appropriately direct its resources to the provision of care. But then when you go into care at home, there are all sorts of ways that I think that we can utilise technology to assist people, whether that be in simply monitoring them in the home in a way that they're comfortable with. And I think we need to very much remember individuals' choice in this sense, but also support them in living at home. And technology, I think, is a real facilitator in this sense, in the very efficient delivery of care services and providing efficiency to providers in the way that they operate as well. I've seen some very small residential aged care providers who have gained an enormous efficiency by utilising technology in the way that they operate. And so that time that's spent in a manual sense in providing, in recording things, can actually be transferred to the provision of care. And that goes to the capacity of the system. So I think that there's a lot of gains for us all to be received by the utilisation of technology. And as George knows, I'm a big fan of increasing our capacity in that sense.
Thanks, Minister. And this is probably the last question. There were differing views from the commissioners as to the regulatory oversight of the sector, both in terms of the governance body and also the quality regulator. There are different views of those. How will they be resolved, those differences, and how quickly will we know what the outcome is of those?
Well, we're going to have to make some decisions pretty quickly. We will respond to the Royal Commission's recommendations by the end of May. So that sets a time frame. The Royal Commission requested that we do that. We've agreed to that recommendation. So you'll all know very quickly what path we're going to go down with respect to those issues. We want to get on with this. As I've indicated, our response to the Commission, our primary response will be provided in the budget context, and we've committed to responding to the Royal Commission's recommendations by the end of May, which, quite frankly, is not that far away now. So there's a lot of work that's going on in that sense right now.
So that allows us, it means that we will know what the answer is to that question by the end of those questions by the end of May. That enables us to have one other question for you because you've been quick in answering that one. And that's about the role of accreditation certification of aged care staff. If we could do two things, just the staffing demands that are required. You mentioned that some initial actions are being taken around that. But when we think about certification of staff, the registration of those staff, and also just the huge demands on home care, if it is to grow in the way that's envisaged by the Commission, just speak to us about how you believe the aged care workforce will be supported by the government.
Well, the registration of the workforce is going to be a really important element for us all. Of course, nurses currently have a registration system that's well recognised and established, but the registration of the personal care workforce is something that's going to be really important. The education of that workforce is going to be really important as well. As we sit right now, about 70% of the personal care workforce has a Certificate 3 level qualification, 30% don't. I've indicated that the understanding skills with respect to dementia are an important part of that process. And I'm also aware that the current curriculum for the Certificate 3 is being upgraded to include, or has been upgraded to include, infection protection control, but also dementia care. And given 50% of the residential cohort in aged care have a diagnosis of dementia, it really needs to be part of business as usual. So, and when you look at the Royal Commission's recommendations with respect to the workforce in residential aged care, they're talking something in the order of a 30% uplift in care time. And so that's a significant uplift in the workforce. It creates a couple of challenges. One, it's got to be recruited and it's got to be trained and it's got to be paid for. So, if you're talking about the recruitment side, that's somewhere in the order of 60 to 80,000 additional people that need to be trained. But you also have the existing workforce that needs to have their skills uplifted. And so we need to find a way to achieve that without disrupting the current providers in their provision of care. So upskill the 70% that currently have a qualification. Recognition of prior learning might be a significant part of that. Provide a qualification to the 30% that don't, and again, recognition of prior learning can be an important part of that process, but we need to make sure that that's done properly. And then, of course, in home care, if we look at, say, an additional 100,000 places, that's about 18 to 20,000 people that we need to recruit into the home care system. So we need to recruit them, we need to train them, and we need to retain all of these people. So the workforce element is a very significant part of the response to the Royal Commission. Some parts of that process are relatively well progressed. For example, the work that's been done on the Cert 3 qualification. But we now need to design the systems in conjunction with colleagues in the education and training portfolios around distribution of the training systems, but also the recruitment of the workforce. But coming off the back of COVID, for example, with people looking for new opportunities and new careers, I see the aged care sector as one where there is opportunity. And, of course, the Aged Care Workforce Industry Council, which has been in place now for about 18 months or so, and really starting to hit its straps with respect to the work, the building and the understanding of career paths for people to work their way through the aged care sector. So when they come in, they see this is where we can progress. This is a career for us, not perhaps just a job that we have while we're looking for another job, is going to be really important. And then, of course, the remuneration is an issue that the Royal Commission talks about as well. So the workforce part of this is a really significant one.
Huge.
In the sector.
Yeah. Can I just say thank you, Senator Colbeck, for both your presentation and also for your willingness to take these questions and for your commitment to improving aged care in Australia. We look forward to the plans that you've set out. I'd like also to thank the audience for the time that you've given, your participation in the discussion, and to remind everyone that this discussion has been recorded and will soon be available on the CEDA website to rewatch and share with your colleagues and networks. You can keep up to date on CEDA's program by visiting ceda.com.au and register for the following upcoming events via the website. On the 24th of March, Net Zero, Jobs and Opportunities in a Climate Positive Future. And on the 28th of April, Strength and Resilience in Australia's Financial System. Please also continue the conversation by connecting with CEDA via LinkedIn, Twitter, Instagram, YouTube and Facebook. And please enjoy the rest of your day. Thanks for being part of this.